The National Revolution is something else. It was a revolutionary movement lasting some 40 years. The construction of a nation-state. It was part of a long trajectory lasting around 600 or 700 years, which, from a divided feudal society with no state in a given area, to a parliamentary democracy. And the National Revolution, in fact, is the stage that enables us to move from the administrative monarchy, which is the last stage of the pre-democratic regime. Let's take a look at all that. First of all, how does national construction work? It's a political and geographical determinism. I'm going to show you a little diagram on my website, which is the model for the construction of nation-states. So you take a space, in fact, that's what it represents. It represents a space, let's say, the synthetic space, the theoretical space, of virtually all nation-states. In other words, it's a space in which you have, broadly speaking, all types of terrain, plateaus, mountains, rivers, etc., with more or less natural borders. So the idea is that you've got a varied space, but one with natural boundaries that are more or less clearly defined. So you've got a river, you've got a big mountain range, and then you've got more arid regions to the south, and so on. Arid regions to the south, say with a large plain, that's what's important, and in an area like this, which has a uniform development, then this uniform development can either be a territory that has never been civilized, that is inhabited by barbarians who have never known state construction, or a territory that has been civilized in particular as part of an imperial construction that has collapsed, leaving the development of a feudal system, and therefore the disappearance of a state. So either there never was one, or there isn't one anymore. In this space, over time, a political power will emerge in the Great Plain. Why in the Great Plain? Because it's simply the best place for economic development. So that's where the economic power is always going to be. Because that's where trade is easy, and that's often where agriculture is easiest to develop. So it's always the Great Plain in a given area that will be the economic center. This is where economic power, the strongest power, will emerge. For example, in a feudal society, the lords of this region will be the most powerful because they are the richest. And so it's here that the heart of the kingdom is created, and it's from here that power extends to the peripheries. What are the peripheries? Well, they're all the regions, which are relatively close to the plain, but which are not the plain, and over which this power will extend. This central political power will then aggregate all these territories within a certain limit, and eventually create a nation-state. So, Guillaume, can you put up the second maps to give you some examples? We could have added more, but I think it's clear enough as it is. As you can see, France or Germany, each time the capital reigns over the area reigns over the space that is the Great Plain, either the Paris Basin or the London Basin or the Berlin Basin in the case of Germany. This is the birthplace of real economic power, which is then able to assert itself over the entire territory, which is considered peripheral, which may be made up of smaller plains, such as the Rhone Valley or the Aquitaine Basin in France, or which will therefore have greater economic power than hilly areas, but which, being smaller plains, will have less wealth and therefore won't be able to resist, or simply areas that are steeper, more rugged, more difficult to access, and will therefore generally be considered peripheral territories dependent on the central power. This is the case for England, first of all Wales and then Scotland. For France, it's the south of France versus the north of France, and for Germany, it's the whole of Bavaria and the whole of the south of Germany. Bavaria and the whole of southern Germany, which would be the last to be truly united with the Prussian power in 1860. As you can see, there's an important geographical determinism. This geographical determinism is exercised, so there are geographical constraints, which are the first thing. For Great Britain, it's easy. It's an island, so the limit is obvious. It's less obvious for continental powers. For example, what's the difference between Germany and France? Two things will dictate the development and boundaries of a nation-state. On the one hand, distance from the heartland, that is both distance from the Paris Basin and distance from the German Basin. And secondly, the ethnic-linguistic composition of the regions. These are the two criteria that count. And when I talk about distance, it's not just distance as the crow flies, it's also the way in which the terrain is composed. For example, if you take Alsace, it's not really any further from Germany, or at least Berlin, than Paris. It was closer historically, linguistically, ethnically, to Germany than to France, nevertheless. You can see that the relief between Berlin and Alsace is much greater than between Paris and Alsace. And so it's these kinds of geographical constraints that dictate the fact that, in the end, this region will belong to one country rather than the other. Then, of course, you have the Pyrenees to the south, which concerns France, and the Alps, which are fairly clear-cut borders, and in an area like Europe. Quite simply, on this geographical level, it's important to understand that a national revolution, which is what I'm going to talk about, only takes place in large, standard-sized nation-states at a given time. In ancient times, the standard size was the scale of the Greek city, more or less. In modern times, the standard size is nation-states like Germany, France, England, Spain, and Italy. That's the scale, and anything smaller are states that are not experiencing the same trajectory, because to have a trajectory from feudalism to parliamentarianism like that, you need to be an area isolated from external disturbances. The idea is that this evolution takes place over 600 years in an area that is isolated from external disturbances. In France, the 100 Years' War, which was a major external disturbance, caused a 100-year delay in this evolution. In France, it took a little over 700 years. In England, it was quicker, 600 years, because England was an island and protected, and we've seen the same kind of delay in Germany. And the countries between them are often torn apart throughout their history because they're equidistant from two major centers, and so they're the object of rivalries. And so, in the end, you find yourself either cut off by a border between two nation-states, or they become buffer states, as in the case of Belgium, for example. You have the case of Switzerland, which did not become a buffer state, but became an independent state, probably because its geography protected it. As you can see, it's much less easy to invade Switzerland than it is to invade flat Belgium. So you see, that's how creation works. And these buffer states, which are smaller, don't generally follow this trajectory. There are elements of it, but they're extremely disrupted, and in the end, they're more dependent on what's happening in neighboring countries, which they imitate and follow in their development, than on a purely internal trajectory. A purely internal trajectory. So there you have it, the first point in understanding how important geography is in the construction of nation-states. So, once again, ethnic linguistic determinism and geographical determinism are both extremely important. So the construction, in fact, very schematically, I'll do another program to explain exactly how it's done, ethnogenesis, but very schematically we have a first stage, which is a feudal system. In this feudal system you have the appearance of a feudal monarchy, which is the first stage in the appearance of a center, and this center, as I said, appears in the richest area. An important stage is the creation of a representative assembly, the first manifestation of national representation. This is the first manifestation of national representation. It's not truly national at this point, but it simply allows the monarch to take his place, which in fact quite simply enabled the monarch, or rather the feudal suzerain. The king at the time was a feudal suzerain, that is, he was first among the fathers of the feudal system, to haul himself up to the throne. Feudal system to rise above feudalism by relying on the legitimacy given to him by an assembly that is supposed to be representative of the whole of society. There are the three orders, the clergy, the nobility, and not the third estate at the base, the third estate being a notion that came late, but which is the bourgeoisie, in fact, at the time of Philippe le Bel, when it appeared in 1302. In England, the model parliament appeared in 1295, under Edward Worst. In Germany, it appeared with Emperor Maximilian's Great Diet of the Empire, which was in 1400. I no longer have the date, but it was in the middle of the 15th century. These are the processions of Castile and Spain around the same time. That's how it works. In Russia, it's the Zemskys on the verge of Ivan the Terrible. So this, if you like, takes the monarchy out of the feudal regime by giving it an authority that is outside feudalism, that is above feudalism, and allows for the gradual transformation into what we call an administrative monarchy, that is, a sovereign monarchy that is no longer feudal, no longer dependent on feudalism, but is based on the very model of the state, of the sovereignty that makes it possible to impose oneself. In France, this is known as absolutism, although it can take other forms in other countries. Absolutism is also something that has been explained a little in retrospect, but let's take the Kaiser's regime, for example, at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th in Germany, was the same kind of administrative monarchy, right? In other words, a regime with a state, with a sovereign power that is autocratic, which is the monarchy, on which the entire body politic depends, and where there is no real democratic control. Even though there may be elections, there may be some assemblies, as in the case of general states, but sovereignty remains in the hands of the central power. And so, the last stage in the formation of the nation-state is what I call the National Revolution movement, which transforms this administrative monarchy into a state of national sovereignty. Administrative. A parliamentary regime, not yet necessarily democratic, but at least based on a representative system. And then, little by little, the right to suffrage was extended until it became truly democratic. So that's what's happening in all the great nation-states. And as I said, a great nation-state emerges when, in a given geographical area, you don't have any external disturbances for a long time. In fact, quite simply for a long time, or at least not very often, and so it allows this inner movement to unfold. The national revolution always follows the same trajectory, lasting around 40 years. In England, it's between the First English Revolution, which began in 1640, and the Glorious Revolution, which ended in 1689. In France, it's between the start of the French Revolution in 1789 and the July Revolution and the 3 glorious years of 1830. In Germany, we're talking about 1918,949. I'll explain why later. In Spain, 1931 to 1975, and so on. You see, always about 40 years. So, before getting into the details of how this unfolds, what you need to see is that there are several important effects that take place over these 40 years. First, there was the transition from administrative monarchy to parliamentarianism. This is the moment when the nation-state, to use a blacksmith's term, becomes hardened. You know, dipping a sword is when you forge it and dip it in water, hence the name. And that's when it acquires its strength and solidity. And it soaks the nation, the national revolution, because it makes it a coherent whole that eliminates regional particularisms. So, what can I tell you? Throughout the feudal period, then the administrative monarchy, what happened was that a center gradually imposed itself on peripheral regions, which themselves were able to develop their own institutions, etc. So it's a bit of an imperial form every time, don't you agree? So there's no unity, there's diversity of customs, sometimes diversity of dialects and therefore of languages. A relative ethnic diversity too, which is slight. Well, between Anglians, well, there's a bit of it between the negotiated, the Anglian and the English. They don't all think they're exactly the same thing. It's the same then in France between the north of Paris, the Bretons, the Provençaux, the Gascons, and so on. And what happens, and in Germany between the Saxons, the Bavarians, the Prussians, and so on. And what's going to happen, in fact, at the time of the National Revolution is that the revolution breaks down local particularisms, national uniformity. It can be very far-reaching, as in France with the République Unie et Indivisible, which really wanted to destroy all local particularisms, which can be a little less advanced, as in Germany and Spain, where a relative federal character is preserved in the construction of the state. But at the time of the revolution, the idea was above all to create a whole. The idea of the French Revolution was to create only French people. The idea of the German Revolution, and Hitler's in particular, was to make only Germans. No more Bavarians, etc., no more Austrians, just Germans. This means erasing traditional boundaries, so we're doing away with traditional administrative boundaries to break down local identities and replace them with boundaries that are considered rational, purely rational. This is how the departments were created in France, by destroying the traditional pays d'élection, pays d'État, which were former administrative units based on local cultural realities. Cultural realities, this is how the Germans created the GAU, which were essentially small governorates, the equivalent of departments, in fact. It was the same thing that had been done, for example, during the Clisson reform in Athens. Clisson's reform in Athens, since the scheme also applied in ancient Athens, with the creation of the DMs, which made it possible to break away from the traditional divisions based on region, affiliation, or caste. To simply have a block of citizens who are equal, who are considered to be part of the same identity as a national identity, which must replace all other identities. Agreed? So that's why I'm telling you that it's hardening the nation-state. It also shakes the nation-state from the point of view of its borders, since, as I said, construction is imperial. It proceeds from a center that gains peripheries. This construction only comes to a halt when it encounters sufficiently powerful neighbors, as I've already mentioned in the case of France and Germany, or when it encounters a clear geographical boundary, as in England, for example. England, for example, where it's obvious that once you've reached the coast, it continues on to Ireland. Right, for standard-sized countries. The revolution is an opportunity. Well, I'm not going to go into the details of this notion. I'll refer you to the very first video, Episode 1 of the Rendezvous de l'Histoire en Mouvement, which is the imperialist revanchard. Let me remind you, the revanchard imperialist. It's a surge of national pride after a defeat, which, by the way, can be attributed to administrative monarchy, which discredits it and triggers the start of the national revolution. And one of the stages of the national revolution is the imperialist revanchard, who pushes the borders as far as possible outside the country until he comes up against a coalition of all the surrounding countries, which forces him into borders that will usually become his final borders. This is how France's definitive borders were set, and this is how Germany's definitive borders were set. Is that clear? So that's why I say that the national state is really soaked by this. Another important thing that happens during a national revolution is the change of elites. In a pre-national revolution country, the traditional elite, which is heir to the origins of the national state, it's still a feudal space, so the aristocracy is a landed aristocracy. A landed aristocracy, and one that remains landed with landed aristocratic concerns. An aristocracy of real estate ownership. Revolution is the passage of power, so it's not neat, it's not overnight, but essentially it's a shift in power. From the landed aristocracy to what we might call the industrial and commercial aristocracy. In other words, what we might call the grande bourgeoisie. You have a program by Adrian Abausi that was quite good on the subject of great fortunes, in which he talked about bourgeois dynasties. Talking about bourgeois dynasties, it speaks a little of this mutation. The two aristocracies in general end up more or less merging, but it's important because it marks a change in the mentality of the bourgeoisie. A change in the aristocracy's mentality because a landed aristocracy doesn't have the same interests, doesn't have the same values. Same interests, doesn't have the same values, and doesn't have the same strategic impulses as a real estate aristocracy, a bourgeois aristocracy. This is because it changes the country's geostrategic focus. The aristocracy of what we might call the ancien regime, that is the administrative monarchy, which is a landed aristocracy, is concerned with the country's limits. Of the country's limits, it's not interested in colonial issues. It had an agrarian vision of power, that is, you hold the land, you defend the land, and you live off the land. Defend the land and live off the land, whereas from the moment we move towards a bourgeois aristocracy, an industrial and commercial aristocracy, we move towards merchant interests, and we move towards maritime conquest. Let's face it, England was not a maritime power for most of its history. One gets the impression that England is the maritime power par excellence. Yes, England began to become a true maritime power from Cromwell onwards. That is to say, it became master of the seas from the wars of Cromwell, who was the British imperialist avenger, even if, as he was on an island, things worked out a little differently. Because that too has an influence, especially as everything depends on geography. And in Cromwell he started the wars, which continued after him against the real maritime power of the time, the United Provinces. But in the same way, France began to take an interest in colonization and to really create a colonial space for itself, and to worry about its colonial space. After the Revolution of 1830, well, from the time of the Restoration, but especially after the Revolution of 1830, in other words, when the industrial and commercial aristocracy truly took power, and it had commercial interests, it was looking for outlets. The landed aristocracy was not looking for outlets for its products. That's the concern of the merchant aristocracy. And so the parliamentary regime is the regime of the merchant aristocracy, which comes to power through parliamentarianism. Agreed? By taking over, by creating a parliament, either directly in republican form, as in all the great Italian merchant cities, or through a constitutional monarchy, which in fact has all the hallmarks of a deliberative republic. And in fact, the first country of standard epochal size in modern Europe is England. There are other countries that have had national revolutions before, but I won't tell you about them here. It's this country that will become the thalassocracy of the age, because it's the first to win everything, if you like. He's the one who settles in, and then those who come after can't really challenge him, even if they may have a power that becomes formidable for him. And once again, I refer you to what we call the second colonial space, which is in fact the real French colonial space, that is, that which took place in the 19th century. Before that, the monarchy wasn't really concerned with colonization. If you look, if we lost all our colonies during the 7 Years' War, I've already told you about the 7 Years' War, 1,756,763, which is the First World War in the truly geographical sense, since there was fighting in India between France and England, and fighting above all in North America, and that's when we lost North America. Why did we lose North America? Because North America was sparsely populated by French settlers, whereas it was heavily populated by British settlers. But what was the difference between France and England at the time? Well, England had already made its national revolution. 60 years ago, as I said, it ended in 1689, and we're now in 1756. Although France was still under its old regime at the time, in 1756, and so it hadn't made this settlement effort because it wasn't in the interest of the elites. And so, of course, we lost the war because we were outnumbered 1-10 in North America, and that's when we lost our colonial empire. Whereas when we were at the same level of strategic development as England, or in any case when we had similar elites, who had the same concern for the colonial empire, our colonial empire was never threatened by the British, and we developed our entire empire in Indochina, in Africa, because we had elites who were interested and who had that concern, right? So it's important to see that the national revolution really did have the effect of changing the elites. And if this transition of elites can take place, it's in particular because the old regime, and therefore the elites of the old regime, are discredited. They have been discredited by defeat. So here we come back to something I'd already mentioned in the video on revanchist imperialists. To provoke a national revolution, you need to be in an ancient regime system. This administrative monarchy, that will characterize it is that there will be a humiliation, usually military, which will discredit the regime and major financial difficulties. In the case of England in 1640 there were difficulties. We simply lost Scotland. I think it was the War of the Three Bishops. I could check, but it seems to me that was it. And ruin, because if Charles I was obliged to reconvene the parliaments, it was for the same reason as Louis XVI later. He had more money, so he needed money to try and take Scotland back. For France, the humiliation came with the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, we lost most of our first colonial space, practically everything in India, practically everything in America, except for the important sugar islands. That's why we weren't ruined right away. We weren't ruined until 30 years later, 25 years later, and that sparked off the French National Revolution. In Germany, as I said, it was the difficulties of the First World War that provoked the revolution in 1918, and then the ruin, the famine, 700 famine deaths in Germany in 1918. The same goes for the Russian Revolution, which I think really began in 1905, and I think that 1917 is just a continuation of that, in a first defeat against the Japanese, the defeat in the Second World War, defeat in the War of 1905, a very humiliating defeat against the Japanese. But financial ruin only really arrived 1917, when the collapse was total. For Spain in 1931, it was the difficulties in Morocco, so on. In any case, as you'll see, the pattern is always the same. Always the same for this national revolution. The motive is always the betrayal of the elites. And the idea, as I told you in the imperialist revenge thing, on the one hand, you've got the bourgeoisie on the rise, who think they could have run the country better. It's time to get rid of the old aristocracy and really take power for itself. But you also have a movement that's generally a popular movement, simply one of national pride, that's going to look for itself, that's having a hard time coping with national humiliation, and that's what's going to give rise to the imperialist avenger. So how do these revolutions work? They always happen in much the same way, which is to say it starts with this stage, which will lead to the setting up of a government. In an attempt to resolve the problem, the powers that be begin to negotiate and agree on the need for reform and set up an assembly. This assembly, in the wake of popular riots, such as the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, the storming of the Bastille, riots in Moscow, riots at the end of the war in Germany, sailors' revolts, etc., every time you find episodes that call for the departure of the central power, the general of the monarch, or to his abasement by the assembly, which, as this assembly is heir to the representative assembly. The representative assembly founded by the monarchy, I remind you, to get out of feudal power, it is populated for the most part by bourgeois, right? So they seized the opportunity to decide that they had to change and create a new constitutional power for their own benefit. So it's the oath of the jeu de paume in France, and there's always that stage in other countries too. I'm going to give you a quick summary to give you the examples, because it's not easy to remember everything. So you have the Reichstag, for example, in Germany, which became the repository of power with the abdication of the Kaiser in November 1918. You had the abdication of the Tsar in February 1917, at which point it was the Duma that became the depository of power. And in France, the Estates General were declared constituent assemblies. and you'll find the same movement everywhere. The next step I'm going to show you will show you the... Can you give us a synthesis of France, please? You'll see this is the diagram. So I've made another summary for Germany and Russia, but we can't show them all at once, so I'll eventually give you the examples with this one in mind. So the next stage is the constituent power itself. The outbreak of the revolution brought power into play every time, despite everything, into a period of chaos within the country, because the Asian bourgeoisie can't hold on to the country immediately. You have a collapse of the old elites, and you also have the will of the new elites to impose themselves. You also have the population, which often seeks to resolve a whole host of old problems, and to make a revolution that is generally much more radical. And so, within this tentative phase of installing the new power, the constitutional monarchy in 1791, the beginning of the Weimar Republic the start of the Weimar Republic in Germany, the power of the Duma and Kerensky between February and October 1917, you have the appearance of a coup d'etat, a radical coup d'etat. This radical coup d'etat overthrew the Constituent Assembly. The result was the Paris Commune insurrection in August 1792. It was the Red Government in Bavaria in 1919, and of course the Bolshevik coup d'etat in Russia. So there are three examples in the French summary shown on the screen. Don't pay any attention to them, I'll come back to them in a moment. Then you have an acute revolutionary phase, which is generally violent. So it's the moment of terror in France. It's going to be the moment of Bolshevik civil war in Germany, and several difficult years of the Weimar Republic in Germany, and then during the war phase. At such times you must be aware that you always have a genocidal episode within the revolutionary phase, which may take place a little earlier or a little later, but in national revolutions there's always one. So it's generally a question of expurgating. I explained earlier the attempt to standardize the country by expunging those who seem most alien to this social body and who become intolerable to the revolutionaries. So these are the Irish. During the English Revolution, since the conquest, the so-called Cromwellian conquest of Ireland was Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, which resulted in the death of some 200 Irish. The death of around 200 Irish, roughly a third of the population. In France it was terror and the Vendée Wars with the Vendée genocide. It's not necessary to go into the legal qualification of genocide, but knowing that it was planned from the outset is all well and good. The important thing is to know that a part of the population was massacred because it didn't fit in with the idea of the national population. And so it's the same everywhere. You have the Holodomor of the Ukrainians in the Russian Empire. You have the Armenian genocide during the Turkish National Revolution, which began a little before 1918, in 1915 or 1913 even, the Turkish Revolution. I'll tell the instructor of history about it, but I won't go into detail today. The same is obviously true of the Shoah in Germany. It's exactly the same. So from that point of view, if you like, it's an event that's historically banal. It's part of a category called national revolution, and every time it's about killing a certain number of people, and it's generally related to the size of the country's population. Since the Holodomor and the Shoah killed roughly the same number of people in countries with roughly the same population in the industrial age. For the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, or the massacre of the Vendée, the general populations were already smaller, and the means used were also a little smaller. This is generally part of the acute revolutionary phase. It's a desire to purge, and it's part of this movement, of this kind of impulse to create a homogeneous national body. To create a homogeneous national body, this acute revolutionary phase then ends with the bourgeois elite, which was in the process of trying to impose itself. So it's Thermidor, it's the repression of the Spartacus movement in Germany. So it's not really happening. In Russia, in the way you'd expect. I identify this in the Russian Revolution as what's known as the Great Turning Point, which is in fact the moment when Stalin established his power, purged Trotsky and all the elements he considered. We often speak of the Russian Revolution becoming right-wing at this point because Stalin was seen as having a rather reactionary nationalist conception, meaning that he put an end to the internationalist character, all of which is something that's a bit removed from the revolution. Revolution, I'm not going to go into too much detail, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to give you a global vision, since the aim is to analyze French history afterwards and to make you understand that quickly. Then there's a phase of revolutionary de-escalation and the installation of a gentler regime. I won't go into all the details because if you look at France and England, for example, it's pretty much a cut and paste affair. And if you go to Germany, if you go to Russia, which are further away in time, it's a little different. Why is that? Because, in fact, if you look at France, if you look at England, this phase of revolutionary de-escalation also involved, through a restoration of the old regime, a partial restoration not seen in other revolutions. Because, in fact, there's what we might call a resonance effect between countries, so it really depends on what the average time is. And when England and France made their national revolution, the average of the time was indeed administrative monarchy, absolute monarchy everywhere. So there was this phase of restoration. For the most modern revolutions, that is Germany, Russia, etc., there was no such restoration phase, quite simply because the average of the time, or what was most widespread, shall we say, or what was widespread among the great powers or among the victors in the wars, was the parliamentary regime, parliamentary system. And so it avoided this, since it was the case in France, it was already the case in England. So it avoided this backward step, although it doesn't appear to have been taken in the later revolutions, because that depends on the general context. That's why I'm not showing it in the diagram, because it's not really determined. On the other hand, you have this new regime, which is a revolutionary de-escalation. You have this revolutionary de-escalation, but you also have... So, at this point, the emergence of the vengeful imperialist in Germany who takes power. So it's Napoleon and Jacob d'État de Brumaire. It's Stalin, it's Hitler in Germany. And in England, as I was saying, it was Cromwell who was to re-establish British rule, English rule, over the whole of Great Britain and over Ireland, but he would not face a coalition of neighbouring countries. Simply because, as England is an island, he's not going to try to grab any more territory on the continent. English imperialist revenge, in fact, takes place on the seas against the United Provinces, and so it avoids... That's why there isn't the phase normally of a coalition against England. So you have the rise of this vengeful imperialist. In most cases of revanchist imperialism, it's defeated by a coalition and the frontiers are closed. In the British case, this doesn't happen, but there's no need for it, since the borders were closed naturally by the fact that it was an island, or an archipelago if you include Ireland, but then things settle down on their own even if there wasn't a coalition. Coalition against England, but the facts are the same. At that point, the territory is finished, as I explained earlier. The elites have changed. In any case, the change in the predominance of the elites, since it can be said that the landed aristocracy is maintained, but from then on it was the landed aristocracy whose principles, the principles of bourgeois aristocracy. Does that make sense to you, Guillaume? Do we have any questions on this subject yet? No, no questions. In any case, it's clear. Well then, I guess it's clear. I hope people follow. Unless everyone has left, which is possible. If you leave, give it a blue thumbs up. So that's how national revolutions work. I'll come back to these national revolutions later, but first I'd like to make a little detour on another point. On another point, which is that these two notions I deal with in the structure of history, which I call necessary history and contingent history. It sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. The idea is that in these trajectories I'm describing, there are things that are necessary that have to happen, that are part of the pattern, and that's what I've just described to you. That is the stages that are to be found everywhere. And then there's what's contingent, that is the way things are done. To give you an example, in Russia the great man of the Bolshevik coup d'etat is usually Lenin, and there's often a widespread idea that if there was a Russian revolution, if there was a Bolshevik coup d'etat, it was because the Germans sent Lenin back to blitz Russia as a kind of common virus. Russia like some kind of communist virus. To bring down, to throw Russia into turmoil, and that it was Lenin who did it, and that without Lenin there might not have been a Bolshevik coup. That's the kind of thing I say, no, it's not true. Because you didn't have a Lenin who arrived in France to carry out the insurrectionary commune in 1792. Because to carry out what we call the Pride Purges in England, which was the equivalent of the Bolshevik coup. Purges in England, which was the equivalent of that is the seizure of power by the radicals during the British War. You didn't have any revolutionaries. You didn't have any revolutionaries who'd been sent by the French or the Germans and so on. And that the Russians didn't send revolutionaries, Spartacus revolutionaries to Germany. It was around the same time. They had contacts since they were all communists. But it wasn't exfiltration, it wasn't Russian infiltration. And in fact, if you look, the leaders of the Bolshevik coup d'etat were Lenin and Trotsky. But Trotsky had been in Russia for a long time. He'd already been involved in Russian politics for some time, and it's likely that Trotsky would have carried out the coup on his own, or that he would have directed it in any case, and it would have worked out pretty much the same, because at that moment it has to work. Because the situation is such that it's like a chemical reaction, if you like. It just happens, it has to happen, there's no avoiding it, right? And that's what contingent history is all about. Whether Lenin happened or not, that wasn't determined. Is that clear? There might not have been Lenin, but the radicals' coup d'etat overthrew the first attempt at power by the communists. The first attempt at power by the new elites. That would have happened, because it always happens. And you see, that's why it's interesting to make historical comparisons, because in fact it allows you to simply isolate variables, as we say in science. If every time you see the same thing, you see that something is happening, then it must be happening. If at some point it doesn't happen, it's because it's not essential to the model. So that's how we come up with a fairly accurate model, and that's how we'll be able to make forecasts later on. So what I call the necessary history and contingent history. Necessary history is about things that have to happen. And contingent history, that is non-necessary history, is the way in which history actually happens. You can't predict contingent history, but you can predict necessary history once you've identified a pattern. If you enter into a pattern, you have the first 4 stages, and you can say that the 5th, 6th, and 7th stages are going to happen. How it's going to happen, that's a question. And I call the historionomic fork, if you like, or you can call it the height of possibility, the set of things, the set of ways in which we can conceive that something that has to happen will happen. You know that there must be such and such a phenomenon, for example, a radical seizure of power. You know that, on the other hand, it could be this particular group of radicals, or another. It could happen like this. It could happen like that, because in the examples we've already seen, there are different variants. So when we try to forecast, it's the height of possibility that we're going to try to identify, and that's what we'll be doing later on, is to say that and that's what's going to happen. How can that happen? Okay, there are softer, gentler versions, but there are also more violent versions, and that's what we're going to try to sort out. So that's the idea of necessary history and contingent history. And that brings me back to the National Revolution. And here you'll understand why there were several cases in France, and indeed several in Russia. We might as well start with Russia, because the good thing about Russia is that I've already talked to you about it when we did the revanchist imperialists, and I explained to you that Putin is a revanchist imperialist, whereas Stalin was a revanchist imperialist. That Putin is a vengeful imperialist, whereas Stalin was one. I had explained to you that, and what I repeated to you this evening, that a vengeful imperialist appears during a national revolutionary movement. And I had explained to you that since 1989, 91, the collapse of the USSR, Russia had embarked on a national revolution. And that was strange, because normally there's only one national revolutionary movement. It's the one that does everything I've said, that is, changes, soaks the nation-state, changes the elites, and so on. If you have, it's strange that there are several national revolutions. So the Russian case is interesting because it allows us to identify in which cases it happens. And it happens in Russia, as I explained to you, because in this case... So in Germany you didn't have that, and it's interesting because it allows us to compare. In Germany, the National Revolution began at roughly the same time as in Russia, 1917 and 1918, 1917 in Russia, and 1918 in Germany. Germany, except that in Germany it ends in 1949 with the establishment of the German Federal Republic, which is free in a parliamentary regime. Whereas in Russia, from 1945 to 1989, you have the USSR, the communist regime. And why? Quite simply because, as I've just said, both begin their national revolution in the same way, and so follow the normal path. What happens at the moment of the imperialist-revanchist confrontation is that you have one who is an aggressor, as the imperialist-revanchist Hitler must be, and you have the other who is not an aggressor, which is Stalin, since he was attacked first by Hitler, who was the aggressor, and so Stalin doesn't find himself defeated as an imperialist reviver. He finds himself on the winning side. He doesn't have time to be an aggressor. He finds himself on the winning side. And this at the end of a war that re-established the regime's legitimacy, since I had told you that the regime, just before the national revolution in the decades that preceded it, was a regime which, as I've just said, was an administrative monarchy, that it was a regime that succeeded in extending itself beyond its national borders for the first time. Louis XIV conquered the whole of Franche-Comté, Besançon, and so on. So he greatly extended France's borders, and survived and safeguarded French power in a very difficult war, the War of the Spanish Succession. As for Russia, I told you it was the Russo-Turkish Wars at the end of the 19th century. For Germany, it was the series of wars that led to the creation of the German Empire. Even if victory was very easy, it would normally have been more difficult against France, but, well, we really screwed up in 1870, so they had an easy victory. But it could have been a long and difficult war for Germany. But it could have been a long, hard war for Germany, which would probably have won anyway, or in any case would have succeeded in creating the German Empire. And so the Great Patriotic War, that is the war of resistance to the Nazi invasion, had the same effect for Stalin. An ancient Russian regime, in fact, the Soviet Empire. And so from that point on, we're back where we started, and we don't have the last evolution towards parliamentary rule, which might have happened if it hadn't been for this, if Stalin, in fact, had been the aggressor and lost the war against a large European coalition. Recently, you would have had a parliamentary democracy established in Russia as early as 1950. Well, that didn't happen. And so you have a return of this national revolution, because that's what history's all about. Once you're back on track, you've got to follow it all the way. So if you're put back on an old regime trajectory of the old regime, let's say that a new old regime has been created, you have to pursue it to the end, right up to the war, and therefore right up to the new national revolution. And that's why in Russia you have this second national revolution, which normally has no place in a country that's following its normal trajectory. That follows its normal trajectory, right? And that precisely is one of the conditions of what I usually call necessary history. It's part of the laws of history, of the structure of history, which I'll explain to you another day because this would take too long. Of necessary evolution apply to a space, as I said earlier, that is not subject to any major external disturbances. Agreed? A space that can develop internally. A country like Germany with Adolf Hitler doesn't experience any major external disturbances. It declares war, then is reduced in size. It's the same for Napoleon's France. Stalin's USSR experienced an external disturbance when it was attacked, when it shouldn't have been, and so the regime was frozen in time. Another example of this, and I'll pass over this very quickly, is the Iranian Mullah regime. The Iranian Mullah regime in 1979 was the beginning of a national revolution in Iran. The regime of the Iranian mullahs meant the seizure of power by radicals, and what happened then? You have the aggression of Iraq, and you have the Iran-Iraq War, which lasts for 8 years. 8 years, 1,980, 1,988 to the memory, and which is a very difficult war of aggression which Iran survived, and which refounded the legitimacy of the mullahs regime as had been that of the Shah before. That is, once again, a new old regime. And so, in all likelihood, we'll have the same thing. Iran will have to go through another national revolution before it can finally become a true parliamentary democracy. So there you have it, this idea that you have for a reason, that it's not necessary because normally a national revolution in a territory that's been left alone, it only happens once. What's the best example of this? It's England, which made its national revolution, as I said, in the 17th century. And since the end of the 17th century, the English regime has remained the same. So it became more democratic because its suffrage, in particular the right to vote, was extended throughout the 19th century. In fact, universal suffrage came later in England than in France, since in France it was in 1848 that it was theoretically definitively installed. In England, I can't remember, but it was in the last third of the 19th century. It's complicated because there are lots of laws that extend it as time goes by. And even in France, some people consider that suffrage isn't really universal until 1944, when women's suffrage was authorized. But all that to say that if there's no external disturbance, the parliamentary system normally remains. There is no new national revolution. And if there is an external disturbance, on the other hand, this can be called into question if, as a result of this external disturbance, the parliamentary regime is broken, and that we have a new authoritarian regime with a well-founded authority that creates a kind of new old regime. Agreed? Right then. And now, if you like, we can put it back. Guillaume, the chart of France that you might not have understood if you'd glanced at your screen while I was speaking, which is that I put 3 cases of national revolution trajectories. This may seem odd, since we'd say to ourselves, there's the revolution, we finished in 1830, it's over. But in fact no, because in France other problems were grafted onto the system, other coincidences made it difficult for the parliamentary system to take hold. The parliamentary system had trouble getting established, and authoritarian regimes came back to shape the old regime. So the first return of the first chance event to hit France was in 1848, the Revolution of 1848. The Revolution of 1848. I don't think it should have happened. It's really a coincidence, and it's due to the uptightness of the bourgeois elites of the time. You know that in 1830, the right to suffrage had been greatly extended, so it was at this point that the regime was to be truly parliamentary, since it was the end of the First Restoration. And so we truly became a constitutional monarchy. From then on, if we had followed the same normal trajectory as England, there should have been a gradual extension of universal suffrage towards universal suffrage, not a brutal extension, but each time extend a little, each time people ask for suffrage. I don't know, give you a third of them suffrage. That's enough to prevent a revolution. Because then, the remaining two-thirds, you gain a third of support. The remaining two-thirds, it's not enough. They may not be happy, but it's not enough to make a revolution. So that's what England did on a regular basis by extending the right of suffrage, and that's what kept the English monarchy going. In France, therefore, Guizot, who was minister at the time, was particularly reluctant, who refused to extend universal suffrage, to extend the right of suffrage, which was a censal suffrage, albeit a rather reduced one. And that's what led to the Revolution of 1848, and led to the immediate introduction of universal suffrage in a country that was not yet mature enough for universal suffrage to be compatible with a parliamentary system, with a parliamentary regime. So who was elected? Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte had authoritarian intentions, so he's going to stage a coup, right, and re-establish an authoritarian dictatorial regime in France, which lasted from 1851 to 1870. The important thing was that France had been lowered geostrategically by its defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. You see, we had become a second-rate power in Europe, very dynamic economically, but militarily we were worthless. Above all, we'd been brought down. We no longer had any, shall we say, strategic ambitions. England saw to that. A bit like, if you like, West Germany between 1945 and the fall of the USSR. In other words, it was a power that had economic strength but no strategic ambition. With Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who established an authoritarian regime, he also revived forms of imperialism, and so he did. I won't go into the details, but he did so by making friends with England against Russia. From then on, England let him have his way a little, and he went on to create Italian unity. It was a whole series of great campaigns. The Crimean War took place in the early 1800s in 53. Then Italian unity came in 1859 with the Battle of Solferino. It's the recreation of French pride, of French power. You have the return of military pride and the return of authoritarian power. Authoritarian power, it's the return of a kind of ancient regime, if you like, where there's no democratic control. There are elections, there are plebiscites, but hey, it's like Napoleon, it's a dictatorship. And so you have an accident which is the defeat of 1,870 right then. A very humiliating defeat that also toppled the regime and triggered the restart of a national revolution as the pattern was set in motion again. I'm not inventing it. It's not an interpretation. We're observing it. The pattern of the French Revolution. In other words, you have defeat. You have the National Assembly, which becomes constituent when Napoleon III, who has been taken prisoner by the Germans, abdicates. You have the Paris Uprising, an insurrectionary commune, as in 1792. And so you have the creation of this revolutionary phase, which is, well, it didn't last as long as the first French Revolution, for what I see as the following reason, is that this time the Constituent Assembly decided to shoot first. It was the Versailles, the National Assembly meeting in Versailles, led by Adolphe III, who decided to crack down immediately, whereas the Constituent Assembly had let itself be purged by the insurrectionary commune. Agreed? So that's why it lasted. The convention regime lasted 2 years instead of the 2 months the commune lasted, before finally being repressed by the return of the bourgeois. But this time, the bourgeois fired first, so the commune lasted only 2 months. From there you have revolutionary de-escalation. These were the early years of the Third Republic, from 1871 to 1885. And then you have the return of a vengeful imperialist figure, General Boulanger, which I'm not going to give up on. I advise you to check out the program by Le Rendez-vous de la Littérature by Adrien Abozy and Jonathan Sorel on Radio Athena, which is devoted to Maurice Barrès, I believe, Les Déracinés, where he talks at length about Boulanger. If you're unfamiliar with the character, this will give you a chance to familiarize yourself with him. All you need to know is that he was a general who made a good name for himself by being very egalitarian, by improving the lot of soldiers doing their military service, and by, in other words, by saying that military service was also for clergymen. So he made himself very popular with the working classes and all those dissatisfied with the new regime, whether royalists on the far right or anarcho-communists on the far left. Quite simply, at the time you could run for office in several departments, so he was elected in I don't know how many departments, several dozen, and his program was precisely a new constituent assembly. He said, we must create another regime. We must not maintain the regime that had been put in place by the Third Republic. Once again, the Republicans were simply giving away power. So, on the one hand, he was very hesitant, he didn't dare, so that's a matter of personal chance, we'll say. It's a matter of contingency. And on the other hand, the others were more diligent in their repression. And so, in fact, he never came to power. It's like Napoleon had a failed Brumaire coup or something, so he never came to power. In particular, one of the reasons he doesn't, I think, is that France was stable, in fact, at the time. There was no economic crisis. There was no serious internal political crisis. There were no threats, unlike, for example, the situation in France at the end of the Revolution, at the time of the coup d'etat of the 18th Brumaire, or the situation in Germany in the midst of a serious economic crisis in the early 1930s. Before Hitler came to power. So, you see, conditions weren't exactly favorable for the arrival of so, if you like, it's a sort of aborted imperialist revenge, really. General Boulanger, and so he couldn't impose himself, so the whole story of the Commune and the Boulanger crisis, in both cases, was a bit abortive. Perhaps also because there's a kind of, shall we say, reflexivity among the populations, that is, as the previous crisis was a century old, the memory of the French Revolution was still fresh in people's minds. Thiers was a historian, so these were people who knew what had happened the first time, and so they had the memory, and so they were more apt to react than others. They were better able to react than people who'd never experienced it, which also favors the violence of a revolution, is that it affects people who don't know the history they're making. If it's people who have already lived through similar events, they don't react in the same way. But nevertheless, the pattern is there. So this shows you that when it comes to repetition, since this is a particular case of repetition, that is a national revolution in a country that has already experienced a national revolution, the trajectory may be affected by the fact that it's a repetition, it may not go all the way, it may be half aborted. That's the first piece of information you need to know. But that's not the only other case in French history. France is probably the best served in terms of national revolution. I can't think of a single case where there have been three. Behind us there's Russia, which has had two, but that's... So the third case is the defeat of 1940. One might ask why then, because the Third Republic wasn't an ancient regime, and we were still in the Third Republic in 1940. But what makes the difference is that in the meantime, there had been the Great War, the War of 1914,918, and for France, this Great War of 1914,918 had an effect. National pride and support for the regime. National pride. Right, not just a political regime, not just parliamentary democracy. It becomes the regime that won the Great War of Aggression. Like Stalin's regime in 1945, like, as I said, the Molus regime in 1988, it's the regime that resisted aggression. It's the regime that won. And so it is now based on national pride, military pride. And from that point of view, 1940, once again, is a re-humiliation after the appearance of that, which totally discredits the elites, completely. The Vichy regime, moreover, blamed the failure on the regime of the Third Republic. But it wasn't just that. It's also true that there were a whole host of reasons for the defeat that weren't specifically to do with the regime's difficulties, but I think it's partly true, though. Not for the Republic's regime itself, but for the army's structures. All you have to do is read Marc Bloch and the way he thought about the army. This is because what characterizes regimes based on a certain military pride is the relative numbness of the structures behind them, which remain on the same lines as before, of the structures behind them which remain on the gains of victory, no longer questioning themselves. And that's why, generally speaking, we end up with very serious defeats. That's why defeats are so humiliating, because you're stuck with the same software that enabled you to win the first time. And you lose the second time. This is also the case in Germany. Take Germany, for example. They lost in 1914 after trying to repeat what they'd done in 1970. Well, the second time it didn't work. As a result, the third time, in 1940, Germany did something completely different in the invasion plan, because it had renewed its elites. So when you've won a major war, you don't question yourself afterwards, so you stick to the same old software and generally lose the next one. So, from that point of view, if you like, it wasn't the Republic itself that lost, but rather the mental structures inherited from the victory of 1918 were defeated in 1940. But in any case, the legitimacy of the entire regime was shattered. So at that point, likewise, the regime's sovereignty was not a Cabdic king, but the usual institutions of the Republic were overthrown. So you have constituent full powers which are not given to an assembly, which is the case. Full powers are given to an assembly when it's a monarch who resigns. Here, almost, we're giving full constituent powers to a monarch because it's an assembly that has just fallen. So that's the very first phase. You have the attempt to set up a new constitutional regime for 4 years. This constituent power is defeated when other revolutionary radicals take power. Revolutionary radicals, and in 1944 the liberation of Paris took place essentially with the greatest force of all, the communists. And the communists were to have a major influence in the post-war years, gaining between 20 and 25% in national elections, which is enormous. So this was the acute revolutionary phase, you could say, where a lot of things were going to happen that didn't have the same degree of violence. There's not the same degree of violence, but there were some violent episodes. First of all, there was the Purge, a very violent episode that claimed tens of thousands of victims. Tens of thousands of victims, both legal and spontaneous. Then there's the provisional government, which is the acute revolutionary phase, 1944-1946, when a lot happens. You have the attempt to implement the national resistance program, nationalizations, that sort of thing, which are truly revolutionary measures. And in particular, after Charles de Gaulle's departure, and under the influence of the communists, this is really the height of the revolutionary moment, January-June 1946, as de Gaulle leaves, and from the moment when de Gaulle is no longer there to counterbalance the power of his prestige and the strengthening numbers of the communists, it's the turn of the communists. In numbers, it was the communists who held the upper hand for a few months, for 6 months in France. They were to lose when their draft constitution was arrested. Their draft constitution was for a unicameral regime with a single assembly, which does not correspond to the standards of parliamentary systems, which have 2 assemblies. I'll come back to this later. This led to a new constituent assembly, and the Fourth Republic was established. The establishment of the new power and revolutionary de-escalation, right? And some 15 years later, as always, we're still in the same ballpark, between 10 and 15 years later. You have a crisis, will lead to the re-emergence of an authoritarian figure, a figure of authoritarian prestige. Again, a military figure, not General Boulanger this time, but General de Gaulle, who returned to power in a coup d'etat. Since Charles de Gaulle's accession to power in 1958, it should never be forgotten, came under the threat of an army coup. So it wasn't explicitly de Gaulle who staged a coup, but it was the military in Algeria who were already thinking of staging a coup. And it was Charles de Gaulle and the Gaullists who used the threat of a coup d'etat to come to power, saying somewhere that he was the remedy for a coup d'etat. Anyway, it all boils down to the same thing. A coup d'etat or the threat of one, it's the same thing. So, unlike Boulanger, and in line with most revanchist imperialists, de Gaulle came to power. And he established a power that suited him, which was the constitution of the Fifth Republic, which is not a democratic constitution. I'll come back to that and explain why. It's an authoritarian constitution in the Bonapartist tradition with strong nationalist overtones. The desire to acquire nuclear weapons and so on. So Charles de Gaulle would not launch the country into conquests in neighboring countries. For one reason in particular, perhaps he wouldn't have done it anyway. But from the moment we were in a system, I spoke to you earlier about resonance, in other words, the general context. We were in a system where the great powers, where France was no longer on the scale of the very great powers of the time. France had already become a second-rate power. The great power of the time was the USSR, the United States. France was a power, but a second-rate one. And true revanchist imperialists, that is those who go beyond their borders, those who conquer around them, I've told you that every time they're at the head of a country that's up to the standards of the great powers of the time. In Hitler's time, Germany was still a great power. It is no longer so in 1960. And the same goes for France in the days of Napoleon and de Gaulle. In Napoleon's time, it was the most populous country in Europe. In de Gaulle's time, it's very different. It's half as populous as Germany, and far less than the USSR or the USA. So, it has an interesting effect, which is that de Gaulle, a vengeful imperialist, isn't going to do the things that a vengeful imperialist normally does, which is to bring a coalition against him and bring him down, and then allow the transition to a democratic regime, as in Germany in 1949, after Hitler's defeat. So he pursues a policy of national power and independence, but he never goes too far. He doesn't wage wars of aggression, and so his regime stays in place and survives. And this was important to say and understand because it will explain a lot. It means what? A vengeful imperialist who doesn't fall. That's the case of Stalin too, the example of Stalin I explained to you earlier. If he doesn't fall and his regime survives him, what does that mean? It revives an old regime type of power. It revives an administrative autocracy type of power. It revives an administrative autocracy type of power. It revives an administrative autocracy type of power. Administrative autocracy, it revives a power that's committed to the trajectory. National revolution. I hope that's clear. Is it clear, Guillaume? Does this demonstration seem clear? Yes, it does. So having said that, that brings us to now. That brings us to this regime that is currently in France, which is the Fifth Republic, which is heading towards national revolution, in other words, towards its downfall.